वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today, it's our pleasure and privilege to have with us Professor Antoine Roth. Professor Roth is an assistant professor at Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan. He holds a PhD in international politics from the University of Tokyo and a master's in Asian studies from George Washington University. He's the author of the recent book, A Hierarchical Vision of Order, Understanding Chinese Foreign Policy in Asia, which was published by Bristol University Press in 2023 itself. And he writes a regular column on Sino-Japanese relations for the Tokyo Review. His research mainly focuses on Chinese foreign policy and the international politics of East Asia, seen from an English school perspective. Today, we have invited him to discuss his latest book, as I just mentioned, A Hierarchical Vision of Order, Understanding Chinese Foreign Policy in Asia. A very warm welcome to you in our Nation State Dialogue series. So congratulations for your book. And let's begin with just, introducing your book in brief and maybe also talking about the central argument of the book and how do you perceive the new world order?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. So yes, my book, the main argument is actually, pretty clearly stated in the title. So what I am trying to do is to try to understand China's vision for international order, which I think is really a topic of global concern at the moment. And the way I try to do so is by looking at Chinese foreign policy in its immediate neighborhood, that is Asia, which China tends to call its periphery. So And I argue that the main feature or the main characteristic of this order is that it is a hierarchical vision of order that assigns clearly distinct places and roles and statuses to big powers, especially China itself, and to smaller powers that surround China, that are part of this periphery. And the second main feature of my argument is that I argue that those ideas about a hierarchical order find their roots in Chinese traditional political philosophy and in that you find clear echoes of China's imperial past. And so what I try to do is to define a kind of the ideal vision of what a hierarchical order would look like in a traditional Chinese philosophy. I draw out this vision kind of in the abstract or kind of in the ideal world that the writers of that era would love to see realized. And then I proceed in several steps. First, I look how this kind of ideal vision actually translated in practice during the imperial period of China's past, then how this vision was kind of impacted and transformed by China's experience of entering the modern society of nation states dominated by the West in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And then I look at how this vision still informs some aspects of China's foreign policy today under the People's Republic of China. And so the five key elements of this kind of vision of a hierarchical order that I identify are the following. First, that order itself is the highest value that political leaders should strive for. Chinese thinkers, as I would argue, both of centuries past and now, see the world of human society as inherently chaotic and messy. And they believe that it is a role of the holder of political power to try to impose order on this kind of chaotic world, and that this mission for Chinese leaders do not stop at the boundaries of China itself, but extend outward to the rest of the world as well. And so even still today, you see leaders like Xi Jinping talking a lot about order, arguing that China is the protector of international order and that it has a role to try to implement order or to preserve order, to oversee order around the world. The second element of this kind of ideal that I draw is that order to be stable needs to be hierarchical simply because human society is by nature unequal. You have people with high capabilities or with high strength, and you have people with lower capabilities and lower strength. And this is kind of the way Chinese thinkers see the world. And it is the same for nation states. You have strong, big powers with a lot of economic resources, military strength, and so on, and smaller powers with smaller population, and so forth. And to be stable, international order needs to recognize this kind of inherent inequalities among states and assign to each of states a role that is befitting its capabilities and status. And so, again, if you look at Chinese foreign policy today, it is very clear that smaller powers surrounding China have certain responsibilities towards China to not provoke it, so to speak, to respect its interests. And in exchange, China says that it is its role to oversee order, to provide economic benefits to others, and to play kind of a role of overseeing the periphery and bringing benefits to its periphery. So again, those roles of China, the great powers, and smaller powers surrounding China are different, and this is how the world should work if you want international order to be stable. The third element that I highlight is the moral quality of China's message. The China's message is that the reason why it is natural that China should play a role of leader is because it is morally superior to other states, that it provides virtuous leadership. And so this kind of moralizing discourse is an inherent part of China's vision of the world and of its discourse about the rest of the world. And still today, again, you see China claiming that it offers a better type of leadership than the United States, which is the current hegemon, and the state that China likes to draw contrast from. So US is described as hegemonical, as bullying, and so forth, and China says that it will provide a better type of leadership that others should embrace because China itself is a virtuous great power as opposed to the United States, which is the bound of much criticism, as I'm sure you are aware. And so the fourth element, of this ideal I draw is the role of ritual in traditional Chinese political thought, but more broadly of kind of standards of correct behavior that are how order is kind of acted and maintained on a day-to-day basis. So today, China is seeking to provide a standard of correct behavior, so to speak, that includes participating in a Sino-centric pattern of diplomacy. China has become really the center of diplomatic life in Asia and is making a lot of efforts to bring states together in China, on Chinese soil on a regular basis, and on providing infrastructures, forums, the Belt and Road Initiative, and other initiatives that bring states together towards China. And so participating in this pattern of diplomacy is considered correct behavior, and incorrect behavior is doing anything that would disrupt this kind of harmonious pattern by causing trouble on territorial disputes, for instance, or criticizing China in a very open manner, or aligning too clearly with the United States against China, because this will disrupt the harmony of relations in Asia and is therefore considered forbidden. And China is very clear about its expectations that other states will conform to this standard. And the final element then that I highlight is the way China is thinking of using the tools of state power, military power, economic resources, and also the use of language, of discourse power, in order to support its vision of order. So China sees the role of military power as first awing other states, displaying overwhelming strength that will deter other states from challenging international order in any way. And if such a challenge does occur, the role of military strength is to punish the state responsible. Economic power in reverse is supposed to be used to offer benefits to states that do comply with China's vision and therefore incentivize good behavior, so to speak. And finally, discourse power, or the use of international speech, is supposed to convince other states to adhere to China's vision of order and to guide them towards correct behavior. So this is those 5 elements: order, hierarchy, moral discourse, ritual, and the way to use tools of state power all together make this vision, this Chinese vision of hierarchical order that I draw in my book.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand, it's something like, the imperial past where, the Qing government was the, the highest or the top, and then you had the sort of suzerainty of other states, and, small powers were binded by whatever the imperial king would say. It's like, something like a Tianxia sort of a proposition. But, having said that, I think the whole idea of what was there in the traditional philosophy or the traditional working of China is completely different from what China stands today. And what you are saying in terms of, the imperial past, I'm just really wondering, how do you see when China today, I mean, the past it was imperial power, and of course there were not so many other powers in Asia which were challenging China or something like that. But yet the China of the past is not the China of present day. And besides, other neighboring and global powers are also not in the same position as they were in the past, So how does this changed world engages with China, and how China engages with this new world, I mean, which is on a different matrix? How does China's cultural, philosophical, and even political knowledge fits into this new paradigm? So can you please elaborate a bit of your view for our viewers to understand how there is a correlation or a dissection with that past?
Yes, absolutely. So I would perhaps highlight 3 elements of response here. The first one is that, of course, this kind of looking at China's imperial past for hints at how it behaves today is not the only lens through which we should see modern China. I am not, of course, claiming that China of today is a simple transplant of its imperial past. Of course not. And I would argue that it is just as valuable to look at China as a modern great power like other modern great powers like United States, Russia, and so forth, or also to look at China as a Marxist-Leninist one-party state, which is the nature of its political system in the modern era. I think those 2 lenses are just as valuable as the one that I adopt in my book about to find lessons in China's past. So that's the first element, that I'm not trying to draw the whole of Chinese foreign policy. The second one is that the reason why I think it is important to look at China's past is that because these traditional ideas that I talk about in my book and the imperial past itself are very much alive in today's China and into today's Chinese politics. So today's Chinese leaders of the PRC constantly refer to classics, refer to China's long and valued traditional culture, and even claim that they are guided by this traditional culture in their international behavior. So I think that's a pretty good reason for why we should take those ideas seriously and look at actually what they do tell, what are the lessons that they hold for Chinese leaders. And I should also mention that the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is the self-declared purpose and mission of the Chinese Communist Party today. It is to rejuvenate China and bring it back to this kind of golden era. This great rejuvenation is also an explicit callback to the Chinese past. Basically, the argument of Chinese leaders is that they were brought low during the 20th century by Western imperial powers, and now it should find again a position that it used to have before. So it is an explicit callback to the past, although, of course, what this past actually is remains a bit unclear in this idea of the Great Rejuvenation. So I think this is also an important reason why it is important to look at the lessons of the past. And I would add a final element is that I'm not arguing that you have this kind of simple and direct link from past to present. I think it is the period of transition when the Qing Empire ended and Chinese intellectuals and elites had to come to grip with this new society of nation states of Western imperial expansion and the new rules they had to discover this new world completely. This had a profound impact on traditional ideas. And what I highlight in my book is the way in which those ideas from Chinese traditional political thought were impacted and transformed to an extent by this experience of entering the modern society of nation states. So the argument is not that those ideas are transplanted just like that in the modern world, but rather that through the process of China's historical experience, those ideas still remain with us in a new form, in a new kind of modification that occurred during this pivotal period where China had to come to grip with the rules of the modern nation of a modern society of nation states.
Yeah, one thing which you pointed out very clearly, and of course that is where it stands true, is the rejuvenation of Chinese nation, which is a continuity in one sense. It has the cultural past as well as the philosophical notions which are imbibed from Mao Zedong to present, President Xi Jinping. That is where I think that could be associated too. But one of the things which many of the scholars have been arguing is on something like the community of common destiny, Professor Yan Shuitong has talked about, which also resonates with this whole idea about how the imperial past needs to be rejuvenated in one sense. But having said that, I think, broadly in China, when I look at the Chinese foreign policy and the New World Order concept, all talk about governance and everything. Broadly, there are two main arguments that come to, the forefront in terms of the New World Order that they want to create. One, of course, is Professor Yan Shuitong's, idea about Wang Dao, which is totally against the hegemonic world which the US has created. It's more of what you're talking about, the cultural values and the rituals of China, something like that. And the other argument is about Professor Chao Ting-Yang's, which is talking about the Tianxia. And many of the scholars have really, dwelt in detail about the tributary system China wants to create and all of that. So what are your views on these two, and how do you see them in the context of what you have done in your book?
Yes. So to speak specifically about Zhao Tingyang and Yan Shuitong's argument, I think, so first, I think they start from a very different position, and they have a very different purpose, because I am trying to use the lens of Chinese past to explain Chinese actual behavior today, the behavior of the PRC. Their mission, I think, is different, is that they are drawing on those same ideas to try to propose, it is a prescriptive mission. They try to propose a new world order. For Zhao Tingyang, it is explicitly a very radically different world order than the one we have today of nation states. He wants to go beyond the nation states and use an ideal of Tianxia, which he himself says, he wants to rejuvenate this ideal, but it's not the same kind of Tianxia that existed at any period in history. He says he wants to use those ideas to find something new, some sort of new grand vision of utopia even for the world today. And even Yan Shuitong as well, with this idea of Wang Dao, of human authority, he describes that as a better alternative to the modern, the way of doing things of the West. And he says it's inevitable that since the US is in decline, something different will replace it. But the way he describes Wang Dao is as an aspiration, not as a reality. He talks about how, for instance, Chinese traditional values and liberal values of the West should try to be recombined together to give something better, and that this should be the source of human authority. So I think it's a very valuable exercise, and I really like this idea of trying to put together the best of Western traditions and Chinese tradition to find something new for the world today. I think it's a very interesting exercise, but it is not the same as trying to describe today's Chinese behavior with the lens of the past. And so in the context of my book, I see basically Zhao Tingyang's and Yan Shuitong's attempts as basically drawing from those ideas with the distance that you see today between those ancient ideas and modern China, the fact that you have this great distance allows authors like Zhao and Yang to basically pick and choose and draw inspiration from those ideas for their own purpose. Because you have such a distance and such a radical difference between the today's China and the China of the past, this allows, this kind of separation allows to idealize the past and to try to draw something from it that those authors can use for their own purpose. In a way, the CCP is doing something similar when he says, that China was always a virtuous great power, that it was in the past, that it was admired by others and it didn't try to invade anyone and so forth. Those are, very partial readings of history. But the fact that this history has become so far from us because China today is so different allows the CCP to try to find elements of the past that it wants to use to justify its foreign policy today. So basically, Zhao and Yan are doing something similar of drawing ideas from China's past for their own purpose, although their purpose is try to imagine a better world rather than justify whatever China is doing at the moment.
Moving away a little bit to what you have talked in your book in terms of different roles of big and small powers in the global system entrusted upon by China. This is the hierarchical approach of traditional China, which is also linked to economic benefits, as I just mentioned about, tributary system and things like that. And you have also mentioned in your book. So however, in the present context, where there's a changed geopolitics and China is at odds to exert pressure on small powers. There are multiple other powers which are, maybe aligning together, or at least a coalition sort of thing, which is putting pressure on China. How is China playing the game of power politics, and what will be the role of other major powers, starting from US, Europe, and of course in Asia also you see multiple powers like Australia, Japan, and others. So how do you see that?
Yeah, so I would divide, in terms of like power politics of China's strategy, the world into basically three zones. The first is Asia, so this periphery that is the focus of my book. Then the global south, so that would be Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. And then the West, being like kind of the kind of alter ego, the opponent that China sees for itself. So within Asia, what I would argue China's objective is to try to slowly push the US out. Xi Jinping has not made any secret of that when he talks about Asia for Asians and and says it's time for that the Pacific Ocean is big enough for China and the US. That means the US should stay on its side of the Pacific and China on its side, and then they would have a peaceful coexistence. So this kind of ambition to push the US out slowly out of the region is no secret, and I think China is using this kind of logic of the hierarchical order to try to induce its neighbors to see things this way and to choose China over the US by giving economic benefits, arguing that binding yourself together with China and economically is the way to fulfill your aspiration for prosperity, but also being ready to punish countries that align too closely with the United States. I think, for instance, of Korea, South Korea, the way South Korea was punished after it accepted to deploy the THAAD missile defense system that the US proposed as a warrant against North Korea, but China saw it as an attack or as a threat against itself and punished South Korea by limiting economic interaction, by harassing certain South Korean companies in China and so forth. So, China is also willing to use coercive tools to try to deter neighboring states from collaborating too closely with the United States. Moving on to the global south, I think China is quite confident that it can compete with the United States and other Western powers for the not necessarily the allegiance, but at least support of states in the global south, because China sees that its own vision of relationship that it says is non-coercive and based on economic mutual benefits and so forth. I'm sure you're aware of this Chinese rhetoric. I think China is quite quite confident that it can compete with the United States, and that it is also more focused on trying to gain support from states in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, than the US is, because it sees the US as too drawn within, too fractured politically and so forth to be effective at this kind of competition. So in the Global South, I think China is quite confident that it is moving forward and drawing other states to itself, which leave the US itself and perhaps Europe as well, although I would argue that China seems to think that Europe is so focused on economic growth and also so dysfunctional internally that it thinks that it can apply the same kind of logic as it does in Asia to the European Union as well. So basically using economic benefits to attract some support for Europe. And I think it is kind of mistaken in that, and it is underestimating Europe's resilience and attachment to its alliance with the United States. But leaving this aside, I think the biggest issue for China is the United States itself, because from China's point of view, United States cannot be changed or induced to accept China's vision of international order, which means that it can only be an opponent. And China today is very clear that the US is basically an adversary, that China and US are in a battle of systems, and that China needs to struggle, so to speak, against the United States in any way it can, and try to limit US influence in its own neighborhood and so forth. So I think that is China's view today. And it is clear that the United States itself is starting to see things the same way, and is also eager to compete with China in the rest of the world. And of course, this competition can be very beneficial for other states that can draw benefits from both sides, that can use support from the United States and other Western powers to strengthen their hands in negotiating with China. But it remains to be seen, I think, at the moment, if all the US plans for competing with China will result in actual, money on the table, and if there will be consistency in implementing the kind of initiatives like the global, this kind of new infrastructure program that the US has announced, because, the financing for it and how much attention will actually be dedicated to it remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Asia, I see during Trump's period, US itself was trying to retreat, from the role that it had in protecting the states, or even, being a guardian for all the states. So there, I think, it was like willingly US gave that space to China. Maybe it's a different tussle now. I mean, we have all the stories about, the balloon, the spies, and, the US shooting down, and kind of animosity brewing up and all of that stuff. But I, sitting in India, also has another perspective, which is, of course, not the direct focus of your book. But I mean, most of the, discussions on this whole new world order really focuses on US-China tussle, and you have also talked about the supremacy of US and how China is looking US as an adversary and all of that. But there are other strong voices of multipolarity, and especially India is one which has a clear and strong stand on this. Now comprising one of the largest population of the world, and our external affairs minister has constantly been asked which side you want to be allied to, whether you want to be on US or in China. I think it has been clearly stated by our present regime and the external affairs minister, Dr. Jaishankar, that we have our own side. You cannot just ignore that, because we are now the largest population of the world. So do you see this as a challenge to China in any sense, especially when we are talking about Asia, and how will this affect China's objectives in this region, or at the global level as well? Because we have other smaller powers like in the neighborhood, like Nepal, Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, all of these are being tussled. And then there is whole of Southeast Asia. I mean, we cannot ignore about how that is being played about. So how do you see that, fits in? And because this is something which our viewers in India would be very keen to know about your perspective. Yeah.
So I believe that indeed India is, so how to deal with India is a big challenge for China that it is actually failing to meet at the moment. So let me start perhaps at the beginning that you mentioned multipolarity, and I completely understand that this is the Indian perspective, and not only the Indian perspective. I would say like Saudi Arabia, Turkey also see the world the same way, and China itself does talk about multipolarity as well. But if you actually look at the domestic discourse and who China sees as a peer, it is only the US. So China likes to talk about multipolarity, and perhaps even it is a remnant of the 1990s where China really saw that nobody could challenge the US. But today, China does see the US as a peer competitor, and nobody else, basically, in China's perspective, fits that bill. And that includes India. So I would argue that, unfortunately, China tends to look down on India as weaker economically, military as well, and look at the Indian political system as, again, too messy. You know, like China is much more centralized and therefore more effective. And this has pushed China, I think, to miscalculate quite severely in its relation with India. The biggest sign of that is, you know, the tussle in the Himalayas around the Galwan Valley and other spots on the frontier, where China has adopted a very hardline attitude and has pushed into India's beyond what India considers its red lines, and is actually arguing now that, well, India should just get used to it, that, you know, it's China's territory anyway, and China is more powerful, so India should just accept this situation and move on. That, you know, we should India and China should focus on areas of cooperation and leave those areas in the mountain aside, which of course India does not accept. And India argues that this issue in the mountain must be solved. This border issue must be solved if other aspects of the relations can go forward. And I think China, for the moment, is unwilling or unable to accept this reality and realize that it has miscalculated in this respect. Because for China's plans to be successful, it needs India's support, or at least you know, assent to, for instance, having an agenda for the global South as a whole, for all developing countries. India, as you just said, is this year will become the biggest country on the planet, and is the biggest country in the developing world. So for China to basically having antagonistic relation with India is completely opposed to its interest, not only in South Asia, but in the world at large, and in its larger tussle with the US as well. Having India becoming closer to the US, which India is doing now, even though, of course, it's not alignment, but it is strengthening its relation with India, and not only with US, and not only with US, but also with Australia, with Japan, which are all have kind of a antagonistic attitude towards China. So for China to basically push India in that direction, rather than in a more neutral stance that would avoid taking any side between US and China, this is again completely against Chinese interest. And so again, I think that it has sacrificed a lot just for, you know, gaining a few grounds, a few kilometers in those remote valleys in the Himalayas, which do not have necessarily such a strong strategic value. So I think it is again a very big miscalculation. And this, in my sense, shows the limitations and the downsides of this kind of sense of superiority that China tends to adopt toward any other state that is not the United States, and this kind of overdeveloped sense of national pride that is perhaps understandable considering China's history and the great humiliation that it suffered at the end of Western powers and so forth. But still, in this day and age, in a relation with countries like India, to still start from this position of superiority and of China being the wronged party and being unwilling to accommodate Indian concerns, again, I think is a big strategic blunders. And this will even become more and more of an issue for China as India continues to rise and becomes an important pole in the international system in its own rights.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. I mean, I think we were very clear when Xi Jinping came up and started talking about major power relations, and it was basically major power means the US as well as Europe and things like that. It was really not considering India, but it was talking about Asia for Asians. And where are these Asians? I mean, the power in India cannot be neglected when you're talking about Asians. You cannot neglect Japan. You cannot neglect Australia. I mean, there are powers which you really need to consider, you know, and if you're not considering about multipolarity within this Asia, I do not think any of the Asian powers would be comfortable to accept this whole propagation by the Chinese or their covert objectives of leading the whole of Asia as the power, and then trying to build relations with US. This whole notion itself is a little flawed, and absolutely agree. I mean, there were these voices in India where it was saying that China has done the blunder of pushing India towards US. I don't think India has really pushed towards US. But of course, there has been a lot of mistrust which has been created. I mean, there was a distrust. And I mean, the whole notion of peaceful coexistence started from this whole India-China relations, right? And it should have really continued about that. Anyway, we'll just continue with our discussions. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you and listening to you, Professor Roth. And we'll continue our interactions. Thank you very much. To our viewers, please keep watching our programs and keep learning. There are many more interesting, videos which will keep coming. We have also had something on world order and discussions about the international systems in earlier videos. Please do watch that. Namaskar.